Good evening. We are delighted that you could join us on this lovely summer evening to welcome Fiona Davis, author of the acclaimed books, The Dollhouse, The Address, and The Masterpiece. She is here with us this evening to talk about her latest novel, The Chelsea Girls. I had the opportunity to read Chelsea Girls recently, and I think this might be my favorite one of Chelsea's novels. She has the ability to bring history to life, and this is especially true in Chelsea Girls, which is set in the 1950s when the country was politically immersed in the Red Scare of McCarthyism. Our local bookstore, Barrett's, and Paige is here, is with us tonight selling copies of The Chelsea Girls. So if you haven't already purchased a copy or want a copy, you can do so after the program, and Fiona will be happy to sign your book as well. This special event tonight is part of our Reach for the Stars adult summer reading program, and it is made possible by contributions to our annual Friends of the Library campaign. Thank you for your continued support to make our collections and programs available to the community. We encourage you to participate in our summer reading program. This year's grand prize is family membership to the Natural History Museum of New York City, home to the Hayden Planetarium. To be eligible for the raffle, you can pick up your Celestial game card and we'll take care of it from there. And just to give you a little bit of background on Fiona, Fiona Davis began her career in New York City as an actress, where she worked on Broadway, off-Broadway, and in regional theater. After getting a master's degree at Columbia Journalism School, she fell in love with writing, leapfrogging from editor to freelance journalist before becoming a popular author of historical fiction. Fiona's books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. Please join me in welcoming Fiona tonight. And if you want this a little...
Ooh, look at that.
Okay.
Thank you. Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful summer day. I really appreciate it. And thank you for supporting your local library and your local bookstore. They are so vital to the community. And it's just a pleasure to be here. I just finished a week-long tour going everywhere from Tulsa to Charlotte, South Carolina. And it's really nice to be back home. I thought what I'd do is talk a little bit about me and about the book, and then read a really short bit from it, and then open it up to questions about this book or any of them. So I write books that are based around buildings. I find iconic New York City landmarks, and then I do a lot of research, and I figure out the plot and the characters and create a book. And they've been from the Barbizon Hotel for Women to the Dakota Apartment House to Grand Central Terminal. But the idea for this book came out in a very different way. It started with a character. What happened was I was researching my second book, The Address, the one that's set at the Dakota, and I had this moment of temporary insanity where I decided, you know what, 2 timelines aren't enough. I should do 3. It lasted about a week, and then I realized I was out of my mind and quickly went back to 2. And all the books really have 2 timelines and an element of mystery that drives the story forward. And in that week of insanity, I started thinking, hey, what about New York City 1950s Broadway? And a friend of mine said, if you're thinking about that, you should meet my friend Virginia. And that's how I met Virginia Robinson. Virginia was born in 1909. Imagine. And she was incredible because she had this amazing memory. She could recall the smallest details, which for a researcher is exactly what you're looking for. She talked about joining the USO tour during World War II, and they went on tour in Europe and performed for soldiers. She said they got paid $10 a day plus meals, which was great. She talked about craving Good and Plenty candy and orange juice while they were on tour. She described World War II as being all about sex and booze. And that sums up Virginia for you, by the way. But she came back to New York and she started understudying on Broadway for movie stars like Fay Wray and Vivian Leigh. She talked about Vivian Lee traveling with 30 pieces of luggage and a cat. It was just wonderful to talk to her. But then she started talking about the 1950s, and her tone got darker. And she started using phrases and that I just wasn't familiar with, like red channels and loyalty oaths. And as she realized I didn't quite know what she was talking about, she pointed a finger at me and she said, "Look it up. Look it up." So I did. And of course, she was talking about the McCarthy era. And, I figured I knew about the McCarthy era. I'd seen the movie Trumbo, right? But I started doing some more digging, and I found a lot of surprises. I didn't realize that there were really two investigations going on at that time. One was through the Senate. It was called the Tidings Committee. And there was a young congressman in that one, the Tidings, you can tell I've been doing this for a week straight. The Tidings Committee, they were looking into Joe McCarthy's investigation, their allegations that there were spies in the State Department. And then in the House, there was a House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, which you've heard of. There was a young congressman named Richard M. Nixon on that one. And they decided, look, the best way to dive into this would be to go after the entertainment industry. And that way we could kind of whip up public opinion into kind of a paranoid frenzy. Come on in and sit down. No need to hang in the back. And so they wanted to really get the public all worked up, and that way they could consolidate their power, which really was what it was all about. And so they did that. And keep in mind that there were spies, and there were secrets being stolen, but not by the actors. And so in June of 1950, Red Channels was published. It was this pamphlet that you could buy at bookstores or newsstands for $1. And you would go through it, and what it had on the cover was a microphone with a red hand about to grab it. And what it did is it listed over 300 organizations and individuals that it said had pro-communist tendencies. And it became basically the Bible of blacklisting. And what it would do, it would list the name of the person, and then underneath it, all of their offenses. And these could be that they were a member of Actors' Equity, which everyone had to be if you wanted to work. It could be that you attended a conference for world peace back in the 1940s. Or it could be that you donated a coat to a clothing drive for Spanish refugees fleeing Franco. And even worse, there are lots of mistakes, and so sometimes names were misspelled, which meant they targeted the wrong person. And what happened is if you were listed, it became really terrifying because it meant the FBI would start looking into you. They'd go through your trash, they'd bug your phone, they'd interview your neighbors. And what happened was the actors really started turning on each other. Now, keep in mind, through all this, there was a way to clear your name. And what you would do is you would go to this corporation called American Business Consultants. Now, keep in mind, they were the same ones who published Red Channels. And you could pay them $200. And keep in mind, that was a lot of money at that time. But not only would you have to pay them, you would have to answer a list of questions, including, who else do you know who's a communist? You had to name names if you wanted to clear yourself and thereby jeopardize your friends' careers, basically. And what this meant was that if you were being investigated and you were listed in Red Channels, there was a good chance that you'd have to go to Washington to testify. Lillian Hellman had to, Arthur Miller had to. And if that happened, you had three options, and none of them were good. You could refuse to name names and be held in contempt and go to jail. You could name names and thereby spread the contagion, but keep on working. Or you could take the fifth. But keep in mind that taking the fifth in the public's view at that time was just as bad as admitting your guilt. And it meant you would never work again. And what really surprised me about all this was that what everyone was being accused of, which was being a communist, was perfectly legal. The Communist Party was a legal political party. And as I said, actors started turning on each other. I talked to an acting teacher named Michael Howard, who talked about one day that he was at lunch with the playwright Clifford Odets, and he realized over the course of their conversation that Clifford Odets had probably named names and probably named him. And he spoke with the most visceral terms, as only, an acting teacher can do, about what that realization was like. And it was true, he was blacklisted, and he became a teacher because he could no longer work as an actor. Some people sold shoes, others committed suicide, because they were there right at the cusp of their career, about to take off, and everything was pulled out from under them. I spoke with the actress Lee Grant, who was amazing, but I have to say she was just as angry 70 years later as she had been at that time. She was spitting mad. And she had a terrible time where in June of 1951, she was nominated for an Oscar for her very first film role. She's fantastic in it. But then she refused to testify against her husband before the HUAC. And because of that, she was blacklisted for 10 years. It's just such a shame. And so what this really created was a black hole of loss, where we don't know the plays we never saw or the performances we never saw, because these people just had to stop working and were done for, basically. Now, other people named names and went on to great fame and fortune. Clifford Odets, Elia Kazan, Jerome Robbins. Now, Jerome Robbins was in a double bind because he was not only being accused of being a communist, but he was also gay, which meant the FBI was blackmailing him. And being gay back then was way worse than being a communist. It meant your life was over. So he named names and again went on to a fantastic career. Now, Virginia Robinson died last year at the age of 99. She was working to the very end. She had a role in Broad City, that very funny show that became an internet meme, even though she had no idea what Twitter was. And I really felt like her story deserved a book all its own, and that's what became The Chelsea Girls. And in The Chelsea Girls, it's about two women who begin as actresses, both of them, and they meet on USO tour. Imagine where I got that. And they become friends, and they move back to New York, and in 1950, they're trying to put a play on Broadway during the McCarthy era. And at that point, one is a playwright and one is an actress. And so the book is about friendship and politics and, of course, the Chelsea Hotel. Now, I had a huge problem as I figured out this story because I'm known for my places, right? Grand Central, the Dakota. And here I had a story but no place. But luckily, the Chelsea Hotel immediately came to mind, and it completely fit the bill because it has been a hotbed of political and artistic intrigue since it opened. It opened in 1884, a long time ago. And the idea was that it would be kind of a cooperative utopia where electricians would live next to artists, next to plumbers, next to musicians. There were 15 artist studios built on the very top floor. That did not work out. It quickly went bankrupt. Oh, I see water coming. Thank you. Should have brought it with me. Thank you so much. And so it went bankrupt, and it became a hotel, like a regular hotel. But it was one where guests could stay for years or even decades. And so many people stayed there. The list of names of people who stayed there over the years is just a who's who. It includes the poet Dylan Thomas, rockers like Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, Leonard Cohen. Sid Vicious famously murdered Nancy in room 100. You have Arthur Miller, the playwright, who sought refuge there after his divorce from Marilyn Monroe and lived there for a number of years. You have artists like Jackson Pollock and John Sloan. The list just goes on and on and on. And even better for me in terms of writing this book was as I did the research, I realized a number of guests had been targeted by the FBI. John Sloan was, W.E.B. Du Bois was. A woman living there named Elizabeth Gurley Flynn I always want to say Helen Gurley Brown, but no, it wasn't her. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was one of the co-founders of the ACLU, and she was not only targeted and investigated, she was imprisoned in her 60s. So it definitely felt like the right place. And I'd been inside in my 20s. I remember poking my head in and then quickly scurrying out because it's kind of intimidating and it's quirky. And, the lobby is filled with paintings because, wall-to-wall paintings and sculptures, because the owner often took art instead of rent when the artist couldn't pay. It's an interesting, very interesting building. Now, recently, it's been bought by a corporation, and it's being renovated, which, to be honest, is a shame because I feel like they're in their efforts to make it into a boutique hotel, they're really going to sanitize the place, which was known for being gritty and kind of crazy. But we'll see. They're talking about doing a roof bar up on the top. We'll see what happens. I was inside doing my research, and the grand staircase still goes up in the very center of the hotel. I was in one of the rooms. There's about 50 tenants still living there under the construction, which is awful. But in his room, the stained glass transom window was still intact. So we'll see. The scaffolding's slowly coming down, and it'll be interesting to see what they do with it. In my research, I found the original floor plans to the hotel and discovered there was a secret tunnel in the basement, which of course I had to incorporate in the plot. That's half the fun. And so it was really fun to research and write, partly because, as it was mentioned before, I did come to New York as an actress, so theater is what I knew. When I first came to New York, I fell in with a theater company, and when I wasn't doing productions of Three Tall Women, I would do productions with this theater company. We did 3 a year. We did everything. We hung the lights. We swept the stages. We took the tickets. One of our shows went from off-Broadway to Broadway and was nominated for a Tony Award, which was very exciting. For that show, I was in charge of the costumes, which basically meant I went to thrift stores and bought things and threw them at the actors and said, if it fits, that's what you're wearing. But because it went to Broadway, I have a costume design credit for Broadway, which is ridiculous. But it was really a wonderful time in my life, and my friends from that time period are my best friends today. So it was wonderful to incorporate that into the plot. And, I really do feel like everything I've done, journalism, acting, has led up to what I do now, which is writing historical fiction. But I have to say the turning point was probably about 5 years ago when I had what I call my year of Ds. I got divorced. My dad was diagnosed with dementia. And then my dog, who was a doodle, died. I know, but there was one good D. I started writing a book called The Dollhouse. That was my first book. And I think that's a loud ring, no worries. I really think that was my way of controlling the narrative, right? When everything was spinning out of control. Because I decided if my characters were happy or sad, whether they lived or died, that was empowering. And it's interesting because it really feels like, it took this cascade of loss for me to stand up and take notice. People often ask me, how do you write a book a year? And my answer is always the same. I live alone. I don't have children, which means my time is mine to do whatever I want with, and I highly recommend it. I think Virginia Woolf sold us short. She should have held out for a house of one's own, not just a room. But it really did take this cascade of loss for me to start thinking about what I wanted out of life. I think the ability to write a book had been there all along, but suddenly I was looking at things differently. And, it was only when I really started thinking about what I wanted out of life and stopped taking care of everybody else, which I know we tend to do, did I roll up my sleeves and get to work. And it was a really hard lesson to learn, but one that I will never forget. Thank you. Thank you. I thought I'm just going to read a really short piece. This is from the very first page of the book. It's the prologue. The book is divided into 3 acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Imagine that. And each act has a really small opening. The Chelsea's known to be haunted. There's hundreds of ghosts around the place. And so each one starts with just a little bit from the point of view of the ghosts. New York City, March 1967. In the dead of night, during the dreary month of March, the Chelsea Hotel is a quiet place. The only sound that cuts through the silence is the squeal of a police siren, and that fades fast. Thick walls keep out the everyday noises of one's neighbors. The muffled swears after walking into a bedpost with a bare foot, or the generous moans of lovemaking. The ghosts of the Chelsea hide in the cement-filled brick walls during the day and glide out during the violet hours to keep watch. Over time, their number has accumulated, from the refined gentlewoman who left behind 4 diamond rings to the puffy Welsh poet sinking from alcoholic stupor to coma. The musicians chant quietly with vaporous breath as the former owner hovers mutely by, wringing his hands with worry. One more to come, very soon. If the woman had more courage, she might jump from the roof. That would be the faster method, instead of this slow slide into oblivion, where every so often a futile panic makes her want to call out, cry for help. But no one would hear, not here. The ghosts jeer at her and point, but she knows they'll eventually welcome her into the fold. And once she's gone, she'll too keep watch over the residents, including her one true friend, who will sigh into her pillow as the apparition leans in close for an invisible kiss. Thank you. Thanks. Now, I have to say, when I did that reading on last Tuesday at the book launch, a book, as I did the very last sentence, a book fell off a shelf. It was so terrifying. So I'm happy to open it up to questions and about this book or any of the others or the writing process in general. Yes? The Chelsea is on 23rd Street and 7th Avenue. Yep, on the south side of the street. Yes? This one's a little different. It does have 2 timelines, 1950 and 1967, but instead of jumping back and forth, it's from each woman's point of view in the same story. So you're getting 2 points of view of the same timeline, and then they both jump together to the later one, just for something a little different. And if once you read it, you'll see why. Yes? Yeah, the question was, when did I decide on the endings? I plot everything out. I'm the daughter of engineers. So I think if I had that blank page in front of me, I would just go eat chocolate all day. You know, I have to know where I'm headed. So I figure out the characters and the plot, and I do a timeline so I can see what's going to happen when. And because there's usually 2 time periods, I'll have Post-it notes with different colors depending on what has to happen where. And because there's this element of mystery, I have to be really careful, because if one chapter gives away too much, it'll spoil the other storyline. So yeah, there are days it's pretty painful. But once I have that down, I have a framework that I can work off of. And things do change, but that at least gets me going. And I know I write 1,500 words a day when I'm doing the first draft. And so I know where I'm headed and what I have to accomplish. And it's not pretty, those early drafts, but over time you kind of sculpt them. Thank you. Yeah, that book was a lot of fun to write. And because it's 100 years apart, it's really easy, especially because 1985 was such an interesting year of fashion and that kind of thing. It was really fun to ground that story in that time period. Yes. Yeah, that's such a good question. So in my research, I go out. I don't just Google. So I'll go interview an architectural historian. I'll go, find someone who's an expert in Grand Central and ask them questions and buy them lunch. And that's where all the gold comes, is really going out and talking to people, because that's where I learned that there was a school of art there that was there for 20 years, which seemed crazy because no one had heard of it. And I know if it surprises me, it'll surprise the reader. And that's also where the character Clara came from, because she's based on a faculty member named Helen Dryden, who actually lived and had this amazing life and then was forgotten to history after being a real pioneer in illustration. And that's where someone mentioned to me, oh, if you're looking at the Grand Central School of Art, look into Helen Dryden. And so suddenly you're kind of going down a rabbit hole, but the story's starting to come to life. Yeah. It's very popular. People either love it or hate it. You know, I really was drawn to it by Kathleen Tesoro, the perfume collector, which is one of my favorite books. And really, as I started doing my first book, I would read her book and study the structure to figure out how she pulled it off, because it's really not easy. If I'd realized how hard it is, I would have never started that. Yes. Yeah, so the question is why buildings? And when I was a kid, my parents are both English, and we'd go back and travel around England to visit relatives. And my brother and I would be beating each other up in the back seat, and they'd stop to let us kind of run around at the ruins or the castles or the grand estates. And I really loved that. The idea that everything was so old there, right? Anything less than 400 years old in England is pretty recent. And so I just started thinking about who lived there and the layers of history. And of course, living in New York, you're walking around and there's layers of history in every building, even as I've been there the past 30 years. And you've seen things change over time. And I was just so curious about how the residents and the buildings have changed over time. And each building kind of comes to me in a very random way around November. And that's where I realize what the next book will be. Yeah. Yeah, it's very structured. So it's 3 months of research, and then about 3 or 4 months of writing a first draft, and then a lot of revisions, which eventually end up going to my agent and then my editor. So it's really, like right now, the book I'm working on now is in the revision phase. Yeah, I try and do something every day. The book tours kind of had me take a break from it, which is good as well, because you want to step back and kind of clear your head. But I find I have to keep on working on it, so I remember all the strings that I have to pull together. I can't step away too long. Yeah, you know, the political resonance of the story really hit home for me as I was researching it. It made me much more interested in trying to bring this story to life and do justice to the people what they'd gone through. And also, you know, McCarthyism is being bandied about all over right now. And to go back to what is that exactly? And where did that all come from? And so we can see what we're drawing from. And I think, you know, as you read it, I think there's a lot of resonances of what's going on today, but it wasn't my goal to educate readers. It's to create a really great story that you can't stop turning the pages. And yeah, so I got my agent. I sent the manuscript for The Dollhouse to her. I'd heard her speak somewhere, and she emailed me and said, let's set up a call, which is always a good sign. And we talked, and she said, I love it, and I want to represent you, and I have a great name for it. It wasn't named at that point. A great title, but I'm not going to tell you until you agree to go with me. And I said, sure. And so she came up with The Dollhouse. And then she was the one who kind of initiated reaching out to all the publishers. So it's a real process. It's one step at a time. Yeah, everyone's been wonderful. The first book, The Dollhouse, took place at the Barbizon Hotel for Women. And one of the women who'd lived there for decades, she wouldn't talk to me at first, but later on she started to open up. And she'd been a journalist. She'd lived there for years. She was great. And she ended up coming to the launch party. It was like the seas parted as she entered. She's about that tall. So that was incredible. And with the Dakota book, I was able to meet some of the residents and get tours of the building, which was really helpful. And in fact, we held a party the day of the launch inside one of the residences, which was really great. So yeah, it's really been lovely. I think because the stories are a mix of fiction and fact, the residents embrace them. Yeah, sure. So I like to read a mix of historical fiction and mystery thriller these days. So I love Joe Baker wrote a book called Longbourn, which is Sense and Sensibility from the Servant's Point of View. Beautiful. Longbourn by Joe Baker. Geraldine Brooks wrote a book called People of the Book, which is about a rare book. And the next book I'm working on is set at the New York Public Library. So I'm very interested in books, yes. I learned in my research, again, kind of what surprises me will surprise others, was that when it was built, they built a 7-room apartment inside for the superintendent and his family. And he lived there with his wife and 3 or 4 kids for, I think, 11 to 20 years. The kids would go up and play baseball up in the reading room using books as bases after hours. And I felt like that could be a really fun, interesting location. So I'm very interested in rare books which people of the book covers. And yeah, lately I just finished Colson Whitehead, The Nickel Boys. Really, really powerful. Yeah, so there's so much out there right now. Christina Alger is a wonderful suspense thriller writer who writes from women's point of view, which is what I'm most interested in. Great. Well, thank you.